kind of invitation. Every time I hear that invitation, I keep on looking around to see who they're talking about. I got to say this, that we're going to get into a slide presentation, but before I get there, I want to talk about a few things. You know, I came here to Canada on September 27th, 1985. This is the house that I grew up in Jamaica. This is me with my grandmother. This is me telling my grandmother that one day I was going to get her out of poverty. And I never got the opportunity to do that. That house is built on stilts, as you can see, because we had frequent flood in there. And I remember being a child and sitting on the veranda and my legs dangling in water without a care in the world, while my grandmother, no doubt, was just stressed to the max. And this is a plantation house that the plantation owners gave to my grandmother because she worked on a plantation. Depending on the season, she would work in a sugarcane plantation, she would work in a banana plantation and coconut plantation. I have 14 brothers and sisters, and she's the love of my life. She died at 97 years old, and she died in that house in poverty. I keep that picture in my office on Bay Street, and now I'm working from home. I keep it here in my office at home for two reasons. One, to remind me where I came from, and two, to really honor Canada. Because as a result of coming here September 27, 1985, as a 16-year-old boy, I was able to achieve the level of success that I've achieved in spite of the fact that I came from that background, abject poverty. And I really honor Canada for that reason, because we always hear about the American dream or the Canadian dream, and the dream, whereby people can come from poverty and they can make something of themselves. Unfortunately, that dream fades and continue to fade, and it becomes a little bit more difficult and impossible for people to achieve. And would like to go back to the time when, because of the generosity of so many people that didn't look like me, I was able to achieve what I have achieved today. And it's about time that I can give it back to those others to achieve the same level of success that I've achieved. I'm going to talk about another immigrant that many people don't really know about. His name was Robert Sutherland. Robert Sutherland, like me, came from Jamaica to Canada. Robert Sutherland was the first person of color to graduate from a university in Canada and also in British North America. Robert Sutherland graduated in 1849 from Queen's University, and he won 14 academic prizes at Queen's. He excelled in debating, came from Jamaica, as I said, graduated in 1852. He got graduate with honors in mathematics and classics. He went on to study law, and he qualified to study law in 1855 and became British North America's first, meaning that anywhere in the British North America, the first Black lawyer. Could you imagine that? That we have the distinction in this country of having the first Black lawyer in the United States or Canada, and nobody knows. Most people don't know that we have that. Because usually when you have something that kind of achievement, it's celebrated, it's written up in history books, right? We just finished Black History Month, and nobody knows the contribution that this guy has made. See, Robert practiced law for 20 years in Walkerton, Ontario, small town. And he died in 1878. And when he died, he left his entire estate of $12,000. $12,000 to Queen's University. At the time, was the biggest gift that the university received. See, it was interesting at the time, because at the time that he gave the gift to Queen's was on the verge of bankruptcy. And that $12,000 gift was 1 year's operating costs for Queens. And that $12,000 saved Queens University. Today, people refer to Queens University as the white university. And most people, even those who attend Queens, don't even know that a black man actually saved that university and why it's actually standing here today. The thing about his donation, what he said was, he was asked by a friend about Queens. And the reason why he gave that donation to Queens and nobody else, he was quoted by his friend as saying, Queens was the only place where he was treated like a gentleman. Could you imagine that? He said, that's the only place where they treated me like a person. And as a result of that, he never forgot, and he gave his entire estate back to Queens. We're going to talk about, for example, the immigration plan. In Canada, the government announced back in October 30th that the immigration plan for Canada. And it set out that between 2021 and 2023, the immigration level will increase by a certain amount, and it was broken down. And the statement was made that, and everybody knows this, everybody on this phone knows this, so on this virtual event knows this, it's the key to the recovery post COVID-19. And these are some of the highlights that was indicated in that press release on October 30th. It says, as we look to recovery, newcomers create jobs, not just by giving our businesses the skills they need to thrive, but by starting businesses themselves. The target, as you know, is 1% of the population to be immigrants, 401,000 in 2021, 411,000 in 2022, 421,000 in 2023. And 60% of those people coming in will be from the economic class. And the press release went on to say the pandemic has highlighted the contribution of immigrants to the well-being of our communities and across all sectors of the economy. Our healthcare system relies on immigrants to keep Canadians safe and healthy. So why the disconnect between the importance put on immigrants like myself and Robert Sutherland, and the lack of representation of immigrants in positions of authority? And for example, and we're going to get into the presentation again shortly in terms of some stats. Based on the Statistics Canada's numbers, 7 in 10 Black adults have a post-secondary degree. 31% of Black women has a bachelor's degree or higher. The unemployment rate, on the other hand, for Black women is 19% compared to 10% for the average women in Canada. The number for Black men, 17% unemployment rate. 1 in 5 Black adults live in low-income situation. 27% of Black children lives in low-income situation. If you have the exact same degree as somebody else, a white Canadian in Canada, you're going to get 20% less than compensation for the exact same degree, for the exact same work, which equivalent to $1.5 billion coming out of the Black economy annually. So those are stats. So let's get into the first slide of the presentation, and let's talk a little bit about what all this means, right? And by the way, when I talk about the immigration, I'm a basketball fan, and I equated to the Raptors, and everybody was a Raptor fan in Canada because it's the only Canadian basketball team. And I'm a courtside guy, and I'm watching the game, and then I see the coach wouldn't play these bench players. He just stuck with the starters, and the starters were just not winning the game. We would get knocked out of the first round of the playoffs. And I would yell at the coach, put the bench players in the game, and he refused to do that. And I called Masai Ujiri, the president of the Raptors. Masai, come on. You got to get Coach Casey to put the bench players in. Give the starters a rest. Masai said, West, he just won't do it. So ultimately, Messiah fired Coach Casey. He was coach of the year and he fired him, put Nick Nurse in. And that year, the Raptors won a championship, but the Raptors were known as having the deepest bench in the NBA. In fact, those bench players are currently the starters for the Raptors today. But there was a coach that refused to play those people because he didn't have confidence in them. So that's the same thing with us here in Canada. We bring all these talented people in the country, and they're sitting on a bench. If you're a doctor in your country, you can't be a doctor here. If you're a lawyer in your country, you can't be a lawyer here. If you're an investment banker in your country and you come here, you can't be an investment banker. You have no Canadian experience. Those people are sitting on the sideline, not participating, not doing what the government says that they should do to win. And that's the reason why through the Black North Initiative, we're trying to change the conversation. So could we get to slide number 1, please, Kelly? So we've done a survey and we asked the question, of the Black community and non-Blacks. And we asked the question, how often are people in your racial group treated unfairly because of their race or culture? 83% of Black people in this country that surveyed said that they're treated unfairly because of their race or culture, at least sometimes. 83%. We asked the same question of non-Blacks. Do you agree that discrimination against Black people is no longer a problem in Canada? And the stats were more than 50%, more than half of non-Blacks say that they don't believe that systemic racism exists in this country. In fact, that number got even higher in terms of when asked about systemic racism. So you ask Black folks, do we have systemic racism in Canada? 83%, yeah, but at least sometimes I experience it. You ask non-Blacks and they go, no, it doesn't exist here in Canada. Next slide, please. So we're going to examine 4 areas where we can see whether or not systemic barriers exist. We're going to look at job opportunities and income support. We're going to look at health and community services. We're going to look at children and youth development, and we're going to look at police services and policing. And again, the whole objective is to see whether or not we have systemic racism in those institutions and organizations. Next slide, please. So let's look at, for example, Black Canadians and how they're treated. I talked about it earlier about the unemployment rate. Black men, 17% unemployment rate, non-minority, 9%. Black women, 19%, and average woman in Canada, the number is a lot different. We talk about, the next slide, please. We talk about the income, for example, that when we look at Black Canadians, for example, 20% less in employment numbers. And the next slide, and how do we break that down when we talk about the $1.5 billion? The average Black worker earned $12,400 compared to other Canadians with the same qualifications, right? And that's where we get the numbers from. This is how it's broken down, right? $7,000 wage discrepancy, occupational segregation, total explained gap, explained gap, unexplained gap, and then we have a total earnings of $12,400. Again, for the same degree, same everything. Next slide, please. So when we look, for example, at a Black person going in to apply for a job and they have a Black sounding name. So the name West Hall is not a Black sounding name. But if you have the name, let's say Pascal Siakam, chances are that that is probably an African name. So how are you treated when you have a Black sounding name? When you have a resume and you put that resume in your job application in, a white sounding name will get 31% of the time they'll get a callback. Black sounding name only 10% of the time. If you have a criminal record and you're white, you're going to get 18.8% callback. If you have a criminal record and you're Black, you're only going to get 1.6% callback. But the most startling information is that white resumes with a criminal record are 1.5 times more callback than a Black resume with a clean record. Next slide, please. So when we look, for example, at discrimination in the workforce, and the question was asked, if we look at, in your group, your racial group, have you experienced racial discrimination when it comes to decisions, employment decisions like promotions and so on? And 49% of Black folks indicated that they do receive discrimination or experience discrimination when it comes to job opportunities and promotions. 39% of Black Canadians agree that the organization has the right mechanism. Only 39%. Those are startling numbers. But is it just in the workforce? The next slide, please. We talk, for example, about the lack of representation in very senior areas. We talk about the fact that 31% of Black women, for example, have a post-secondary degree or higher. 7 of 9 Black people have a university degree, but yet look at the numbers. 7 of the largest energy companies, they have no Blacks in their C-suite or on their board. 5 of the largest bank, it's now 5 because 6 CIBC made a change. No Blacks in their C-suite or on their board. 5 of the largest telecom providers, no Blacks in their C-suite or on their board, and 2 of the largest life insurance company has no Blacks in their C-suite or their board. Next slide, please. But it doesn't just stop with the in the private sector. The public sector is the same thing as well. The Supreme Court of Canada, we have no Black representation there. Bank of Canada board, Office of Federal Parliament, and heads of armed forces, and I know that. In the federal government, there's some changes that's been considered, and we expect that that's going to be positive. But at the end of the day, as it currently stands, there's a long ways to go. Next slide, please. How about COVID-19 cases? 26% of COVID-19 cases in the city of Toronto are Black people. Yet Black people only represent 9% of the population in the city of Toronto. And to put it more starkly, the 5 hardest hit neighborhoods for COVID-19 in the city of Toronto are Black neighborhoods. The 5 least hit neighborhoods are white neighborhoods in the city of Toronto. So if I live, for example, at York Heights in the city of Toronto, where the population is 19% Black, the infection rate is going to be 20 times that of the beaches, where the population is only 2% Black. If I live in Weston, which is 33% Black resident, the infection rate is going to be 14 times the infection rate of the neighborhood that I live in, which is Rosedale. Next slide, please. So how about other health outcomes, as I talked about earlier? Black in terms of health, in terms of versus Black versus white Canadians, and women in particular. Black women see 3 times higher rates of diabetes. And one may say it's diet or it's in the genes, but it's really not. It's really about access, and it's really about opportunities. 1.57 times higher rates of hypertension among Black women compared to white women in Ontario. And they see 60% higher rates of psychosis among segments of the Black population compared to the general public. 16%, by the way, of the hate crimes in Canada are committed against Black people. Those are very high numbers. Next slide, please. Then we'll look at family physicians. And we know in Ontario, for example, it's difficult to find a family doctor. You have to get referred by a friend. 29% of Black women do not have a family doctor in this province. Yet the average is 8% for the average Canadian woman or Ontarian woman. Next slide, please. Now look at the school system. Graduation rate, for example, 84% for white students, only 6 to 9% for Blacks, and 20% dropout rates for Blacks versus only 11%. There are 2 times higher dropout rates for Black students. Now next slide, in terms of the actual expulsion rate. The expulsion rate in the Toronto District School Board is 4 times more for Black students than white students. And they call it from schools to prison. that there's if you are expelled from school, there's like I was reading the Star yesterday that indicated that there's 6 times more likely that you're going to end up in prison if you're expelled from school. And as the student indicated that, I watched many of my friends get expelled or kicked out of school for very little reason. And what are some of those little reasons that they talk about? And Deloitte did some amazing work in a study that they've done recently. And it indicates that Black girls, for example, would be expelled from school because they're wearing these hoop earrings, because it's viewed as rebellious. And Black boys would be expelled because they're wearing hoodies. That's considered to also be rebellious. But if a white girl wear the same earring, it's not viewed the same way. And if a white boy wear a hoodie, it's not viewed the same way. So we have to change those narratives. Now we talk about, next slide, please, policing. And how significant is it? And so both groups, police was asked this question by whites and Black Torontonians. And the question was asked, can the police be trusted to treat my ethnic group fairly? 74% of white residents in Toronto say yes, they can. Only 26% of Blacks answered in the affirmative. They asked the next question, can the city's police be trusted, or are they honest, rather? 72% indicate yes, white Canadians, white Torontonians. Only 41% of Black Torontonians say yes. So what does that mean? It means that there's a disconnect. And there's this acrimonious relationship that's been going on between the police and the Black community, and it needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. And why is it? 32% of cases involving police firearm in the city of Toronto are against Black people. 36% of cases involving police use of pepper spray in Toronto are against Black people. 37% of cases involving police strikes in Toronto are against Black people. 41% of cases involving police grounding or other force in Toronto are against Black people. 46% of cases involving police taser usage are against Black people. And 57% of cases involving police dogs are against Black people. Again, Black people represents 9% of the population. These numbers are disproportionately high, and they're crying out for attention, for someone to do something about it. Next slide, please. How about the way the federal prison system? Indigenous people represents 30.4% of the federal prison population in Canada. 5% is their representation in Canadian society. Between 2001 and 2020, the numbers went from 17% to 30%. For Black Canadians, on the other hand, represent 3.5% of the population, represent 8% of the inmates. 80% increase between 2001 and 2020. See, when Blacks and Indigenous people go into the prison system, there's a rating that each of them receive. And unfortunately, the Blacks and Indigenous people receive the higher rating, and the higher rating prevents them from getting counseling programs, and those counseling and programs allow them to get parole. And because they are denied those programs and counseling, they stay in the prison system longer. When you look at these stats, 30.4% of federal prison inmates are Indigenous people. Doesn't it show that if you walk down the street, chances are you're probably going to be mugged or robbed or hijacked somehow by an Indigenous person? That's what the numbers suggest, but that is not the case. We're not afraid to walk down the street and be harassed or attacked or robbed by an Indigenous person, but the prison federal population suggests that. 42% of Indigenous women in prison, women in prison are Indigenous women, 42%. Those numbers suggest that we do have a serious problem. Next slide, please. On policing again, 70% of civilian deaths in police shootings in the city of Toronto are against Black people. Again, Black people represents only 9% of the population. I am 20 times more likely to be shot dead by the police than my neighbor. That is a problem. And the next slide, please. But it's not just a Canadian problem. It's a global problem. We see, for example, in the UK, we see, for example, in Australia, these numbers are startling numbers. That is a global pandemic. And that's the reason why the attention is brought to this issue globally. Just like COVID-19, anti-Black systemic racism is a global pandemic that has to be addressed globally. Next slide, please. So what does that mean when it comes down to business? Moody's did a study, a survey, and they actually McKinsey, let's go to the McKinsey survey, because McKinsey did a survey and they found something very interesting, and it goes really in line with what we're talking about on immigration. They did a study in 2020 and they found that gender and ethnically diverse executive teams are 36% more likely to outperform their peer group. So having racially, ethnically, gender diverse organizations, it's actually not just a nice thing to do, it's a profitable thing to do. Lloyd's Banking Group in the UK, they had an increased rating by Moody's, which Moody's is the first rating agency to actually rate how companies are doing with respect to their race plan. And Lloyd's put together a race action plan. And the race action plan is similar to what we've done with Black North. Actually, we did it first. And they indicated that 3% of their senior roles will be filled by Black people by 2025. That's what we've done with respect to Black North. 3.5% of senior roles and boards will be filled by Black Canadians by 2025. Why did Moody's decide to give them the ratings that they did? They said the underrepresentation rather, in financial services of ethnic minorities, and in particular Black staff, and at the senior level, is a social issue that is subject to increasing scrutiny by investors, regulators, and politicians in several countries. It is on everyone's radar screen. Next slide. So, all organizations last year, the NBA, Major League Baseball, soccer, NHL, they all came out with statements. And the statement was that we need to deal with systemic racism in our society. So what did OSFI do with respect to financial services? Because the financial services sector is the biggest culprit. And the problem with the financial services sector is that it creates wealth for people. So if you're denied wealth in the system, you're denied access to the system, you're denied entry into job opportunities in the system, chances are you're not going to gain wealth. So OSFI said, our supervision of financial institutions include assessing their management of reputation risk, as reputational events can impact an institution's financial position. And I couldn't sum it up better. The Globe and Mail summed it up in the September 7th article last year. It says systemic racism is a serious business problem that requires a serious business solution. Canadian companies that fail to act will learn the hard way that racism hurts us all. So I want to thank you for the time. I left some time, hopefully, for questions. So Adrian, I'll kick it back over to you to moderate that. You're on mute.
Yeah, I was having some trouble there. Wes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that very, very insightful and very, very provocative presentation. It was very engaging, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you. I suppose the first question I have is, what difference will representation make in these spaces? Why does it matter, and how is it going to fundamentally affect the system which reproduces poverty?
So Mckinsey has done some amazing work in the area of this area, right? And they teamed up with Kellogg to do some work in the financial services sector in particular. And this was, unfortunately, was just a U.S. number, but the number is no different from Canadian. And they indicated that if in the U.S. they close the racial gap, that they're going to see 4 to 6% higher increases in GDP rate increase by 2028. 4 to 6% growth in GDP just by getting people off the bench and getting into the workforce. That translates into $2,900 to $4,300 in GDP per capita. So the fact is, the numbers speaks for themselves in terms of why having an inclusive workforce is the right thing to do. But representation matters. If I see someone at the very top of an institution, it shows that I can get there. If I see no representation at the top of that institution, it shows that there's a barrier for me getting there. And chances are I may not be as motivated to work towards getting there because there's just too many obstacles. And the other thing that McKinsey did was they look at a few things that happens within organizations, for example, and they look, for example, at microaggression. And we hear that expression quite often, but we don't really know what that means. And they defined it, and I'm going to read it to you. It says small acts of racism, whether intentional or not, signal disrespect and lack of belonging, having your judgment questioned unnecessarily, needing to provide more evidence of competency than others, addressed unprofessionally, being mistaken for someone of a lower level, contributions ignored, having demeaning remarks about people who look like you, and most often victims of microaggression are Black men, is what they indicated. I was talking to this woman yesterday, Black woman in the US. She's the most senior Black woman in any organization in the United States, the most senior. They run an asset management firm for 30 years, and for 25 of those 30 years gave outsized returns to their investors, amazing return to investors. So they're setting up a fund focused on Black people. And they're getting all kinds of pushback, she said to me yesterday. They're questioning our capabilities and our abilities, and we have to prove this and prove that. So she said, Wes, I was talking to my friend Michelle Obama on this because I had to talk to somebody because I just don't get it. And she said, Michelle, here's the problem. And Michelle Obama said, Barack and I goes through the same thing. And here's the expression we use nowadays. We have to show our receipt. That's what the First Lady told her, that her and the former President of the United States say today, that we have to show our receipt. Why is that expression so profound, right? It's like we have to show evidence that we have, if somebody challenged us, you usually show your receipt, right? If you're going out of a store and somebody said, did you buy that? Or do you own that? You got to show your receipt. I work very hard in this country. I have a nice car. One of them is a Ferrari 458 Spider. When I stop at a stop sign, the most frequently asked question that I get from people is, how can you afford a car like that? Most frequently asked question. Just average person walking by, hey, how do you afford a car like that? Right? And I ask myself the question, how many of my neighbors get asked that question when they're driving their fancy car down the street? I've never heard them complain that they've gotten that. So representation matters. See, if they see people like me driving cars like that more often because I have the income to afford the car, they wouldn't ask that. When I walk into a boardroom and somebody mistake me for a male person or somebody who's there to bring sandwiches in, they wouldn't ask that if there's more people like me in there. And there wouldn't be less of people like me in places like Rosedale because we would have the income to afford these neighborhoods. The beauty about Canada is that there's nothing preventing us from living where we want to live. There's an income disparity that causes us to not live where we want to live. If you don't have the money, you can't live in certain neighborhoods. And so that's why this financial desert that the Black community has to be fixed, because if that desert is not addressed, we're going to have generations of people that just have no representation in places that matters.
Wes Hall, many people are going to hear your story and they're going to be inspired by your story. It really is a remarkable one. And you alluded to that in your presentation. They're also going to say, though, that Wes Hall is an anomaly. Wes Hall is not the rule. He is the exception. He has the ability today to call up Masai Ujiri. How many people have that ability to get in touch with Masai? He even knows people who are on a first name basis with Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. That's not normal. That's not common. They're going to say that you have way too much faith in this system, that the system actually cannot be reformed. It needs to be dismantled and reconstructed and reimagined. What's the evidence that this system can actually be reformed and that we can create a more equitable society?
I think you're right that it needs to be, they are right in the sense that it needs to be reconstructed, but unfortunately, it takes a lot of time to reconstruct something. And, so we have to look at what we have and figure out how can we work with it to make it better.
Well, let me ask you, what needs to be reconstructed? If you're saying that, what aspects of the system do you think need to be reconstructed?
I think it's a mindset, okay. Put it this way. I live in a house that was built in 1872 in Rosedale. It's a great, great house. From the outside, it looks great. Well, when I was looking at it, it was like, and I walked inside, it was horrible. It was on the market for a year and a half. Nobody wanted to touch it, right? Why? Because of the fact that, it's the walls were falling apart. The basement was leaking. The roof was leaking. It was just a mess. It was neglected for many, many years. Okay. So I have a choice. Either I come into the house, I put some blood, sweat, and tears into it and some money, and I fix it, or I don't. And then when I die, I hand it to my kids and they can figure it out and they can fix it. Those are my two options, right? So I decided that I'm going to fix the house. I spent 2.5 years of my blood, sweat, and tears and money into it, fix the house. And all the people who came to look at the house before when it was on the market for a year and a half, they go, man, why didn't I have the vision to do that? Right? The fact of the matter is that we've been handing a broken system to our kids for generations. We go, we're not going to fix it. We're just going to hand it to them. They can figure it out. And because nobody wants to put in the work into trying to fix the system. And how do you fix the system? The system is about people's mindset, right? When you think about all those people back in the 1800s and 1600s and their monuments have been ripped down today, they were celebrated back then. That's why they built monuments to show their accomplishments and how proud people were of them. And today, people are ashamed of them. So the question is, are we going to continue along that path whereby we're leaving a broken system? We see that there are problems and we have the ability to do something about it and we do nothing about it. So when you mention about the people that I may know on a first name basis, if I just sit in my cozy neighborhood in this neighborhood and say, I'm not going to do anything to help to reform the system, then I am contributing to leaving a broken system to my children. And that's why we're saying we're working it with as many people as possible to do what they can do, starting with their own organization, and then bringing those experiences into society. And I'll give you an example when I say that. The Black North Pledge is about starting from the top. Look at your own organization. Look around the boardroom table. Are there Blacks and Indigenous people around the boardroom table? If there are none, ask yourself if there's a systemic reason for that, right? The systemic reason could be, I only recruit former CEOs to my board. How many Black people are former CEOs in this country? Hardly any. So there's a systemic problem that you need to address, right? Then you go into the C-suite. I only recruit people who had a P&L experience in my company. How many Black people have that? Zero, or not many, right? So you look at all the different criteria that you may put in place. Doesn't mean that those people are not capable or qualified. It just means that you put barriers in the way that unfortunately those people don't have that there because historically they haven't been given the opportunity to build that type of resume, right? I came from a mailroom to becoming the right-hand guy for a general counsel of Canvas Global. I had no credentials to get that job, but he saw something in me that thought that you could do this, Wes. And as a result of that, that built confidence in me to take on increased opportunities and roles to get to where I'm at today. So I describe myself, again, I'm a sports fan. I describe myself as a running back. Okay, there's only one, generally 2 running backs on a team. And the job of a running back is to run into people or to run through people or to see holes and break the holes and run. And the job of the other side is to hit them every single time they can.
Wes, I was going to ask you, are you Barry Sanders or are you Earl Campbell?
Well, I think I'm a little bit of Barry Sanders.
Barry Sanders. All right.
The Duke.
Agile.
Yeah, there you
Okay.
go. So, but what happens is that every time he's hit, he knows he's going to get hit. But his job is to get up as soon as possible and look at the person that hit him and go, you're never going to keep me down. Okay? And then when he sees a little bit of daylight, he goes right through that daylight, and next thing you know, he's scoring a touchdown, right? But let's say a quarterback try to be a running back. What happens generally when that happens? They get off the field, they're taken off the field because they're not built to be a running back. Sometimes there's only a handful of people that are built to continue to experience systemic barriers and just keep on going and going. And it's not fair that somebody who's worked so hard, who've graduated university with multiple degrees, keep on having to deal with these barriers and having to be a running back in order for them to be successful in business. So, even though I may be a rare commodity, I shouldn't be. Because if the system is different, naturally, there will be a lot more people like me, because I'm not the smartest guy in the room. I'm not. I hire people who are much smarter than me. But guess what? I was given opportunities that people that look like me were never given, or they've never met those people along the way. And like I said, over the years, those people are shrinking, and those opportunities as a result are shrinking. And we need to go back to the time when we look at our companies and reform it and say, no, this is not right. When I look at my company and there's only, 2% of the people that are minorities, that's a problem. We have to address that problem. That's a systemic problem in our own businesses. And then we got to use our influence as business people to now go, what are the problems in society? Healthcare. When my employees go to access healthcare, are they treated differently? When their kids go to school, are they treated differently? When they try to get access to capital, are they treated differently? And then we use our collective influence to change that. That's how you reform the system.
Wes, no one could ever accuse you of lacking ambition. You, with your Black North initiative, you want to bring 3.5% of, you want to have 3.5% representation of Black folks in senior positions and on boards of directors across this country. So far, I believe you have about 500 CEOs across the country who have bought into this project of yours. Tell us a little bit about the kinds of conversations that you're having with these CEOs. Are they doing this? Is this just about kind of window dressing? Do they actually believe that systemic racism is a real problem? Like, tell us about the kinds of discussions that you're having with these folks in senior positions.
So listen, I'm going to show the picture again. Okay. People say, yeah, Wes, you're an overachiever. How could you not overachieve when you come from this? How could you not? Right? This, according to everyone, that's impossible. You can never go from there to here. Right? So, so there's no such thing as impossibility for me. When I started the Black North Initiative officially last year, I never had failure in my mind. I never thought that this was just too big a task to do. I just go, if we can get people that I've worked with for many years, that respected the work that I've done, and we can get them together. And it just so happened that I'm in the C-suite, advising these companies, these board members and so on. But what started it? Let me go by what started and then we talk about the difficulty, right? I wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail. And the op-ed was entitled, When I Look in the Mirror, I See George Floyd, because I was profoundly affected by looking at the police officer with his knee in George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I was profoundly affected by that, and I didn't really know what to do. And I sent a note to all the boards that I'm serving on and my colleagues, and I said, I'm going to take a mental week off, because it affected me mentally, just like it affected all Black people. Like, there's not a Black person that I know that watched that video and didn't really break down, or part of them broke down, right? That they felt just like useless and felt like a nobody, and that's really how I felt. And I'm a successful guy. and I felt that way. So could you imagine the average person who doesn't really have my clout, who can't call a lawyer when stuff like that happened to them, and then just have to swallow it and just move on? So I start to think about my own experiences like that. When I get pulled over and I just have to illegally and ask for license and registration because my car is too nice, and then I have to just swallow my pride and my civil rights and just hand it to the officer who refuses to tell me why. And then I just got to drive to work and go do my conference calls like nothing ever happened. So I talk about me jogging through the neighborhood, my neighborhood, Rosedale, in the article. And the article was entitled, "When I Look in the Mirror, I See George Floyd." And I talk about jogging through the neighborhood, and I saw a white woman fell in front of me. And I hesitated to help her because I didn't know if she was disoriented. And if she's disoriented, she'll be fighting me off. And then my white neighbors would see this black man looking to be fighting with that white woman, call the police who is white, and I know the stats regarding the city of Toronto. I have no identification with me. I'm the only black man that live in this neighborhood. And then I'm going to say to that police officer, "Oh, don't worry, I live here. And I was just trying to help her. Give me some identification." I don't have any, right? So I hesitated, and we have to hesitate as black people, which is completely unfortunate that we have to do that. So I wrote about that. And then my colleagues and people I've done business with start to go, "Oh no, Wes." The first call I got was from the CIBC, Victor Dodig, my friend, who is the CIBC CEO. Victor said, "Wes, can I call you?" He texted me, called me, and he said, "Wes, I'm really sorry about what I read. What can I do to help?" Then I got a text from Prem Watsa. Prem Watsa is known as the Warren Buffett of Canada. Prem said, "Wes, can I come over to your house?" Went in my backyard, we social distanced, we talked, and he said, "Wes, I came from India 30 years ago. I built an amazing, he's one of the most successful entrepreneur in North America, Prem. Very unassuming man." Prem said, "I came from India, built a very successful business. And I know black people are treated differently, but until I read your article, I didn't get it. What can I do to help?" And I started getting calls and calls from all these different people. And I said, let's start this group called the Canadian Council of Business Leaders Against Anti-Black Systemic Racism. And let's have our members sign a pledge, and let's get as many people as possible to do that. And we're going to start by looking at our own organization and see if there's systemic barriers in there. And then we're going to use our collective influence to change society and remove barriers in society that keeps black people from moving ahead. And then we're going to use that exact same playbook and use it in the Indigenous community as well. And when we raise both communities at the bottom up, everybody is raised at the same time. And we're going to have a better Canada for it. Let's do this for Canada. That's what I said to these folks. Let's do this to create a better Canada. And let that be our legacy that we're going to leave behind. And I start to get people saying, okay, let's do that. So we draft a plan, send it around to folks. The biggest pushback we have from people is, why just focus on black people? Why? You should focus on everybody, because they're at the bottom. There's no other, those stats that I mentioned about unemployment, about the criminal justice system, about the education system. Black people are at the bottom. Their house is on fire. Let's not go down the street and go, let's just douse all the other houses that's not on fire. Let's focus on the one that's on fire. And if we focus on the one that's on fire, none of the other houses in the neighborhood will be in danger. None. And so that's the reason why we're saying to folks is that let's focus on that community, and then let's move it to the next underserved community. And then as we raise up those on the bottom, everybody's going to be raised up. So I'm encouraged by what I've seen. We have a lot of work to do, but having, that many companies representing $1.3 trillion in value, saying that we're going to change organizations and put in timeline in terms of when they're going to do what they say they're going to do, I think that's very encouraging. And I'm pretty confident that in the future, there'll be a lot of me's. I'm a lonely guy. I love company. I want to be able to see a lot more people that represents Canada. Like, when I walk down Yonge Street, I see an eclectic group of people, and it makes Canada a rich place. I can go to, have Greek food in Greektown. I can go to Little Jamaica to have Jamaican food. I can go to Little Italy. I can go to Chinatown. Isn't that what makes this culture so rich? But why is corporate Canada devoid of that richness, right? We want to make sure that that richness spreads. And that's why we're doing it at Black North.
Wes, we have about 7 minutes to go, and I really want to encourage the folks who are watching us to share some questions that you might have or comments. You can certainly go to our little chat section here. You can send your questions to Kelly. So please do, if you have any questions, I'd love to raise them with Wes. Wes, what are some practical things that some of the leaders in our midst could be doing in their own spaces to make the kind of change that you think will result in, again, a society where people are able to kind of fully realize their potential? So what are some concrete steps that our leaders could be taking right now to address this matter of anti-Black racism?
I think allyship is critical, no question in all aspect. Something as simple as who are my supply? What's my supply chain look like? Does my supply chain represent Canada? Because that's where wealth is created. But in your own organization, for example, do people have unconscious bias training? Why is that important? Let's say, I came from Malvern. So when I came from Jamaica, and in that house that that my grandmother grew, so I came to live with my dad. My dad came here in 1970, and my dad got married here, and he bought a place in Scarborough in Malvern. Malvern is a very tough neighborhood, but it was paradise comparison to where I came from. So when I came here, it was this, it was just this melting pot of beauty, right? But I left my house, my dad's place, because we really didn't, I didn't know him. And I left at my senior year of high school. And I really worked and put myself through school and did crazy jobs and stuff like that. Well, let's say my first day into the workforce after graduating university, I walk in and my tie is crooked, my suit was not the best, right? And I sit next to a kid who graduated the same time as me, and he's from Rosedale. And he looked at me and he goes, didn't your dad taught you how to tie a tie? Well, most Black kids are from single family households, right? So all of a sudden, saying that to me, it's a culturally insensitive comment to make, but it's not his fault, because nobody really taught him how to be culturally sensitive. Nobody taught him that's what you call unconscious bias, right? Because he lived in a neighborhood whereby he's prepared for this job his entire life. He went to university, his parents paid for him. He was taught how to dress, put a tie on, probably from the time he was 2 years old, right? He probably has his own suit from that time, because usually rich parents think it's so cute having little Johnny in a suit. And the first thing they do is put him in a suit, right? And I've seen my first suit when I went into that job, right? And the fact of the matter is that if we don't recognize those things when in business as bosses and so on, we're going to find that those people, those Black people, and we're going to be alienated from our companies, right? And they're going to hit these barriers every single time because there's no training provided as to how to deal with culturally sensitive issues, right? So I think that if you want to be an ally, those things within your organization have to make sure that those little things that we view as natural, there's nothing wrong with that person say, hey, didn't your dad teach you how to tie a tie? However, what's wrong with it is that he didn't take the person's background and culture into effect before that statement was made, right? And that's why we need to make sure that we think about those things. I have a company, QM Environmental, that we have 450 employees. And as of last year, every single employee had unconscious bias training, every single one of them. And it makes the company better.
You also seem to be suggesting, though, that leaders need to become much more intentional in mentoring and in trying to provide people with support, the very supports that they need.
Exactly right.
Yeah. We have another question here from the audience, Wes, and it's any specific recruitment tactics that have been proven to overcome systemic barriers, like, for example, hiding names in screening stage.
Well, we talked about, for example, about the black sound in names and white matters. In fact, Rogers did something interesting that they're not really hiring based on resumes anymore. And people go, well, wait a minute here. What's that's my qualifications and all that kind of stuff. But I shouldn't be here based on my resume, right? Because based on my resume, well, before I got that job, I was in a mailroom, right? So if somebody look at that resume and go, well, you can't do this job. But what that person did was when I did the interview with them, they kind of get a sense as to who I am. They got a sense as to what my lived experience was. They got a sense as to leaving home early, putting myself through school by working in the evenings and doubling duty and all that. And they also recognize the fact that all I needed was a break, right? So if you just hire based on somebody's resume, you'll never be able to determine those things at all, right? And so if we start to think differently about the recruitment process, who we recruit, how we recruit, I think we're going to have a lot richer organizations, and we're going to have better talent. We're going to have people who are naturally gifted. There's some people who are terrible that you went to school with and they're terrible at exams, right? And they get C's and D's. But those are the people who tend to be entrepreneurs, and people tend to be like leaders because they just don't learn the traditional way. So if you now say you have to have gone to this university and your average must be A plus, West Hall would never have been, because I was never A plus student, right? I had too much going on in my life trying to get through school to be an A plus student. I'd never get those jobs. And as a result of that, Canada would be deprived of talent as a result of using that yardstick just to determine who gets in and who doesn't.
I'm going to ask you one last question, Wes, and then we're going to wrap up. And the question again is from the audience. What are your thoughts on companies that are starting to tie bonuses to diversity goals for CEOs? Is this an effective strategy?
I absolutely love it. Enbridge is the first company in Canada to have done that. To say, first of all, what they've said is not only to say we're signing the Black North Pledge, they said that 30% of our board will be Indigenous, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and 30%, 28% of our entire workforce will be that. And they talk about their supply chain will be diverse. And then they tied executive compensation to achieving these objectives, right? You mentioned earlier that is it just lip service signing the pledge? It's lip service if you don't do something that says, if you don't do this, these are the consequences, right? And you're penalizing yourself for not acting. And, so companies who actually tied, compensation, executive compensation to achieving diversity objectives, 100% of the time they'll achieve the objective, 100% of the times.
What gives you hope?
The people I'm talking to daily, the conversations that I'm having. It's funny because you mentioned about the lady I was talking to yesterday, one of the most powerful person in corporate United States. They came to my attention because of the work we're doing at Black North. They came to my attention because they go, we want to do this work in the United States as well, right? And we always look at the US and go, we got to model what they've done. But Canada has gone its own way for years. Assisted dying, gay rights and marriage, gay marriage, and so on. All these different things, we tend to go our own way and do things, but other things we tend to look at the US and see what they're doing. This is a movement, and then Harvard reached out and said, we want to do a case study in Black North. 3 Black-related case studies in 10,000 case studies that they do at Harvard Business School. This is the 3rd, because they look at what we're doing and go, we've never seen it before. And we want to follow it. We want to teach it in our business schools because we think it's a good thing that you're doing, right? So this is it certainly is beyond my expectation, but it gives me hope because based on the conversations that we're having, Black North has been taught at about 3 universities now in their MBA program. And, those are training the next generation of leaders to be inclusive and how to be inclusive. So that's what gives me hope that we're going to see a different Canada, a more inclusive Canada. And as a result of that, it's going to make your job in immigration, dealing with immigration a lot easier.
Wes Hall, thank you so much for a very, very, inspiring presentation. You're not just talking the talk, You are walking the talk. And I mentioned earlier that no one could ever accuse you of lacking ambition. I don't think anyone could ever question your commitment to community. The fact that you have stayed grounded, despite the fact that you've achieved, tremendous things in the corporate world in this country, really is a testament to your, well, it's a testament to the kind of quality individual that you are. And I think many people have recognized that and continue to be inspired to reach higher heights as a result of your example. So Wes Hall, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it this morning.
Thanks, Adrian. Appreciate it.
Okay. And